What do you think about when you think of the digital? Do you think about computers? Something to do with ones and zeros? The idea that digitality is related only to computers and that these are, in turn, powered by mysterious zeros and ones can lead to some pretty troubling assumptions. Chief amongst these is the idea that computers function as if by magic, rather than physical processes. To borrow a phrase from Wendy Huikong Chun, that computers are the result of sorcery, where source code seems as alien to us as the spells in a fictional grimoire. To counter this, I want to try and argue that digitality can be better understood as billions of tiny electrical fingers, rather than ones and zeros. Beyond this, I want to suggest that when understood this way, we can better understand how and why the nature of digitality has impacts on the physical world, going so far as to say that this quality had a direct impact on COVID lockdown policies here in the UK. Now, I might not be able to make this link very well, but I am going to try, and along the way I'm going to provide a range of definitions of digitality and a short history of numbers and the digital that might make you question your understanding of the digital as just something more than contemporary computers. I want to break down the way we understand numbers and computers and attempt to relate these understandings more to the human body than anything else. From there, we move away from understanding computers as mysterious and can better see them as just like us, as counting numbers on their fingers. But their fingers are electrical transistors, and they have billions of them. When digitality is understood this way, as material devices, not abstract concepts, it allows us to better understand the problems that can arise. If computers are understood as similar to us, we can see how errors creep into their actions, just like how humans make mistakes sometimes too. So, what do I mean by digitality? Let me start by asking, what does digitality mean to you? Obviously, it must mean the quality of something being digital, but what does that even mean? Well, I can think of a bunch of different definitions of the digital off the top of my head. To begin with, it's probably best to think about how something can be digital versus analog, like the difference between playing records versus playing MP3s. Sean Cubitt, a pivotal figure in the field of media studies, writes about this distinction between the analog and the digital, focusing on photography. Analog media, like photography, he writes, creates an analogy with the world observed by establishing a one-to-one correspondence between, in this example, light falling on a surface and the light-responsive chemicals applied to it. Such correspondences underpinned late 19th and 20th century theories of realism and technologies of fidelity in fields like recorded music and cinematography. Digital media use a different system. Instead of tracking the real in the manner of a phonograph needle agitated by the vibrations of the air, digital devices sample ambient sound in discrete packages. Digitality, according to this thinking, is the difference between things being continuous or discrete. When something is analog, it's defined by a smoothness rather than as discrete units. We can think about this in a variety of ways. Think about weighing scales using an old spring system or weights. There really are no discrete intervals that tell you exactly when you've hit one weight or another. The scales move smoothly through measurements. When exactly does something weigh a specific amount when being weighed on an analog weighing scales? Well, it really can't. The units of analog measurement are endlessly divisible. By comparison, thinking about using digital weighing scales, things are measured in neat units. Of course, what's being weighed is never exactly one weight or another, but close enough that we can stop measuring within a certain degree of accuracy. Thinking of digitality as discrete measurements, we might think of digitality as defined by these discrete measurements, and therefore as defined by numbers. Break something down into discrete parts, it becomes a lot easier to start building things up again into new shapes or machines. Friedrich Kittler, an absolute legend in the field of digital media, discussed how, with numbers, everything goes. Modulation, transformation, synchronization, delay, storage, transposition, scrambling, scanning, mapping, a total media link, on a digital base will erase the very concept of medium. Instead of wiring people and technologies, absolute knowledge will run as an endless loop. Okay, so yes, this is a lot. But Kittler was someone that was enthusiastic about computers and machines. For him, they're going to irrevocably change society. So the idea that converting media into numbers will change everything is hardly surprising when talking about Kittler. Once we start measuring things, like the weighing scales, in discrete units, some, like Kittler, might say that we lose the quality of our analog engagement with that thing. Rather, we start to engage with things as composed of discrete units. Getting all the way back to the notion of playing MP3s versus vinyl, we can see where this can have a tangible impact on our lives. Listening to a vinyl record is an experience that relies on a particular machine and particular parts of that machine to have physical properties that are tailored specifically to accomplish specific tasks. The head of the needle on the record player, the grooves in the vinyl itself, the quality of the copper wire connecting everything together, all of this impacts the sound and the experience of listening. This is what it means to be analog, where even the smallest of details can have an impact, as we aren't boiling an experience down to something discrete beyond a certain resolution. By comparison, when did you last care about what you listened to Spotify on? Maybe you didn't have enough data, maybe you didn't have enough download speed. These are things that can impact your listening experience to digital media. But do you really care if the song is being played off your iPhone or someone else's? If they aren't connected to exactly the same headphones? You shouldn't really care that much, because the songs, after all, are digital. They've been broken down into discrete chunks and are being played back at a set, though sometimes variable bitrate, where a level of quality is determined by how minutely the song has been broken down into these electronic chunks. The digital then has a lot to do with discrete things, and something to do with numbers. Breaking songs into chunks might possibly get you thinking about my electric fingers from the beginning of this talk, but I think we can do a little better than that to make the connection between discrete units, numbers, and fingers more clear. The answer is probably right in front of you. Some of the earliest counting systems in the world, and the concepts of discreteness that come along with that, came from attempting to count things by using our bodies, our hands, and our toes, our literal digits as a means for keeping track of units. This comes from the amazing book, The Universal History of Computing by Georges Ifra, who charts a history of computers all the way back to the Stone Age. Ifra's work helps us to understand how our relationship with numbers was formed, but also how philosophical concepts, like the notion of nothingness that is zero, forms alongside them. Digging deeper into this, Ifra outlines the processes by which we came to understand the world as discrete entities, by counting using our bodies and fingers. But there's still something deeper at work here. Thinking again about analog devices, there really is no true boundary between things in real space. While counting is incredibly useful, the concept that something is truly discrete, truly separate from its context, and can be aggregated into combinations or augmented by some sort of base value. These notions are tied to numbers and thinking numerically, but have no real basis in reality. It took us thousands of years, from the invention of numbers to the formulation of special relativity and quantum physics, to truly remind ourselves that discrete entities do not exist in the universe, but instead function as a product of and simultaneous input into the universe. However, while it's interesting to discuss the philosophical history of numbers, their role in the creation of the digital is perhaps what's more important here. This leads to a discussion of Leibniz in the 17th century, via computer historian Jared O'Regan. Leibniz was a mathematician that experimented with different base values for thinking about numerical systems. Rather than simply thinking along the lines of the base 10 system that we know, where counting is accomplished by stacking 9 counters in ascending order, then moving one column to the left, Leibniz was fascinated by the elegant simplicity of binary systems, where counting is accomplished through a base 2. Rather than a system of tens, hundreds, and thousands, Leibniz was intrigued by a system where columns denoted 2s, 4s, 8s, 16s, and so on. A reason for this was based in Leibniz's interest in analog computers. Leibniz designed a series of devices called step reckoners that utilized a series of various switches and levers to calculate certain mathematical problems. Within this device, states were defined using the logic of base 2 numbers, where something either was or was not. While it might seem a huge way to go from hand-cranked devices that can do certain sums using gears and levers, all the way to modern computers, in fact, the stage was set for the evolution of modern computing devices. Now, the work of Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace was incredibly important in pushing the scale and scope of computing devices beyond simple calculation engines to accepting actual programs in the forms of punched cards from a Jacquard loom. The work of Alan Turing was essential in resolving the work of each of these geniuses into a rigorously understandable form that could, theoretically, be enacted on electronic devices. To that end, figures like Claude Shannon and Johnny von Neumann, as well as the numerous Polish mathematicians, designers, and engineers that constructed early electrical digital computers that Turing would himself edit, are all essential to acknowledge as cornerstone figures in the engineering of the modern computer. All of the work completed by these figures, as complex as it is in actuality, relied on the simple idea that it's possible to mimic the vast and limitless complexity of our seamless and entangled reality to a certain level of accuracy, using discrete units and values. We live in an analog universe, and analog machines are great. But these figures through history realized that digital machines might be able to be constructed to a level of complexity that would make the barrier between analog and digital almost meaningless. While Leibniz, Babbage, and Lovelace were able to conceive of computers that used metal gears and switches, thread and punched cards, or other everyday materials to do the work of being in either a positive or negative state, functioning as an allegory for the binary mathematics they were emulating, it was not until the invention of electricity and the vacuum tube as a means for manipulating the storage and flow of that electricity that modern computers as we conceive of them could really begin to take shape. We can think of these devices functioning just like a human counting from 0 to 1 on one hand, raising or lowering a finger, raising or lowering voltage within a vacuum container. Rather than having to manipulate gears or switches directly, being able to control electronic voltages through vacuum tubes began bringing the electronic fingers of these machines twitching into life. To truly create something useful, however, much more than 10 fingers were required. Within ENIAC, the machine that inherited knowledge from the designs of Alan Turing to become the first programmable computer, there were 18,000 vacuum tubes. It wasn't long, however, until the unwieldy design of these large glass tubes was no longer practical for the kinds of designs the computer engineers had at the time. And so, with the dawn of the transistor, a kind of solid-state alternative to the vacuum tube, computers began their journey through what has been called Moore's Law, in which each new generation of computer designs brings forth double the amount of computing power in half the size. This has, by and large, continued to this day, albeit with more of an emphasis on efficiency than power alone, to the extent that a modern computer processor, like the one in contemporary iPhones, the A14 chips, contains just shy of 12 billion transistors in its main microprocessor. A 5 nanometer thin silicon wafer printed on electrically conductive material using concentrated beams of light in conditions that would make centers for biological research look like pigsties. It's these billions of integrated transistors that are the billions of tiny electrical fingers that I wanted to talk about today. These fingers are the machinery on which contemporary digitality is built, and the specifics of how they function characterize the digital culture of today. But just what do I mean when I claim that they characterize the digital culture of today? Well, What I mean is the design of these machines depends on thinking about reality in terms of discrete units, whether that's zeros and ones, or more complex values based on complex assemblages of bits and bytes. When these machines are not really dealing with truly discrete things in the first place, instead they are manipulating quantities of electricity within a complex universe. Although they give us a picture of the world that we live in, it's a simplified and abstract picture of our endlessly complex universe. A good first step, I think, to acknowledging how not really discrete the values within computers are, and how this tension between discrete abstractions and endlessly complex reality can shape our world, comes from understanding electricity as itself having a form of agency. Jane Bennett, the new materialist philosopher, takes on this task extremely well, writing about the 2003 blackout of North America, a sudden and unexplained power outage that took the lives of around 100 people. Bennett argues that the electrical grid is better understood as a volatile mix of coal, sweat, electromagnetic fields and computer programs, electron streams and profit motives, heat, lifestyles, nuclear fuel, plastics, fantasy of masteries, static, legislation, water, economic theory, wire and wood, to name just some of the actants. She notes that while there is always some friction among the parts, for several days in August 2003 in the United States and Canada, the dissonance was so great that cooperation became impossible. The North American blackout was the endpoint of a cascade of voltage collapses, self-protective withdrawals from the grid, and human decisions and omissions. The grid includes various valves and circuit breakers that disconnect parts from the assemblage whenever they are threatened by excessive heat. Generating plants, for example, shut down just before they are about to go into full excitation, and they do the same when the system voltage has become too low to provide power to the generator's own auxiliary equipment, such as fans, coal pulverizers, and pumps. What seems to have happened on that August day was that several initially unrelated generator withdrawals in Ohio and Michigan caused the electron flow pattern to change over the transmission lines, which led, after a series of events including one brush fire that burnt a transmission line and then several wire tree encounters, to a successive overloading of other lines and a vortex of disconnects. When we think about the bits and bytes within a computer, neat, magical, zeros and ones, we don't appreciate how these values and expressions are expressions of electrical charge. Matter that is extremely volatile and able to behave in sudden and unexpected ways. Bennett's idea that the electricity caused a shutdown before reaching full excitation, for example, speaks volumes about the private life of the matter behind a power out. Similar events are documented in the excellent video, "The Universe is Hostile to Computers," by YouTube educational content creators Veritasium. They outline how physical phenomena like solar flares has caused problems with computers that have resulted in planes falling out of the sky, and bizarre and unrepeatable glitches in video games and computerized tills and voting machines. This video, and the examples contained within it, get right to the heart of the issue of thinking about computers as based on physical machines rather than purely abstract properties. We might not think that ones and zeros could be manipulated by solar flares. After all, when was the last time your math homework suddenly changed itself? But when we think of these ones and zeros as physical entities, suddenly new possibilities jump to light. So, at the start of this video, I promised a connection between all of this and COVID-19. And what could any of this possibly have to do with coronavirus and the policies that were put into place within the UK? The answer to this lies in the related model that was used to inform decisions that Boris Johnson's government made in relation to lockdown, vaccination, and the wearing of masks. The most commonly used simulation tool was known as Covidsim, which informed the various reports that in turn became the UK's policies for the coronavirus pandemic. created by Professor Neil Ferguson among many others at the Imperial College London. The Covidsim tool uses data from the Centre of Systems Science and Engineering at Johns Hopkins University, alongside the UN World Population Projections data on the number of healthcare workers for each country obtained from the World Health Organization National Health Workforce Accounts, or NHA for short. Ascertaining this data, figuring out how many doctors, nurses and midwives were these available, and balancing this with a mathematical model that simulates contact patterns between people in a given country, the simulation was able to project casualties and other outcomes from the coronavirus. The simulation is now in its 6th version, but the first version was something of a pet project by Ferguson and his team. The product of almost 2 decades of work, the program was written in multiple different programming languages and had numerous deficiencies that professional software designers might have called poor practice. And this is exactly what happened. On the 6th of May 2020, a collection of programmers, spearheaded by one anonymous contributor, requested that the model be taken down and investigated due to failing to produce repeatable outcomes. As far as these programmers were concerned, this was due to software and software alone, to the ones and the zeros of the program, and that it should be able to run on any computer anywhere in the world. This idea travelled far, reaching the attention of MPs and COVID denier groups who called for a reconsideration of the lockdown policies and practices then in place in the UK. To them, the decision to enforce isolation, wear masks, and furlough based on what they perceived to be a faulty computer program was unforgivable. It's possible to see where they were coming from, of course, as millions of people's lives were irrevocably altered in enormous ways. But, of course, just because something is digital, that doesn't make it magical. These ones and zeros have a physical side to them that's just as important, even if it is often overlooked. In fact, the program required, in that very early stage at least, a very specific type of computer configured in a very specific way in order to run correctly. On the web page for Covidsim, it was specified that it worked best on a 32-core Intel Xeon-based computer with hundreds of gigabytes of RAM. Given that Ferguson and his team had been working on the program for years, it's reasonable to assume that Covidsim was being executed on a machine powered by 2 16-core Intel Xeon Golds from about 2016. A machine like this would have cost in excess of £10,000. Perhaps it goes without saying, but not every one of the well-meaning hackers that tested the code on GitHub were using machines of this caliber. Going all the way back to where I started in this talk, the idea that digitality has its roots in human understandings of our body and materiality as only ever an abstraction of something more whole and complex than ever truly discrete. I think it's worth bearing in mind what's gone wrong here. That our faith in computers and the digital more broadly goes beyond thinking about computers as complex machines and extends to a belief that computer programs are divorced from the machines that run them. The expectation of COVID deniers that a computer program of such enormous complexity should be able to run on a laptop speaks to how we've lost touch with the idea of the digital as rooted in something physical. But what do you think? Is it important that we consider digital technology and its history in human bodies and human culture? Or is it just more important to think about what the digital has become today alone? Let me know what you think. And maybe drop a comment below. I'd love to have a conversation about the nature of the digital and how this can have a real impact on our contemporary culture and society. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to talk to you again soon.